Hi there everyone, welcome to this week's video where we're going to discuss Plato and Epicurus on death, or perhaps more specifically, Plato and Epicurus on why you ought not to fear death. This week amounts to a kind of culmination of our Platonic journey so far. We went from the Euthyphro, where Socrates is hanging out outside of the courthouse, to the Apology, where Socrates lays forward his legal defense of his behavior. And then after that, we went to the Crito, where Socrates refuses to escape his punishment and violate the laws of Athens. And now finally, in the Phaedo dialogue, what we're going to see are Socrates' last moments, namely his last moments before his execution, wherein he's going to drink hemlock and die a pretty gruesome death. Now, there's a notable shift that takes place between this dialogue and the dialogues that took place before it. Scholars oftentimes think that in the Phaedo dialogue, what happens is that we get a more directly Platonic interpretation of Socrates. In other words, it's probably the case that in the Apology dialogue and the other dialogues that we read before, Plato was, for the most part, trying to faithfully represent the way that the actual historical person, Socrates, was in some of his final moments. In this dialogue, we can kind of see that Socrates becomes a mouthpiece for Plato in order for Plato to propose his own unique ideas. Part of the difference that we can see between the more Socratic Socrates and the more Platonic Socrates is that here all of the stuff about ignorance and so on, I know that I know nothing, are more or less out of the window. Now, this more Platonic Socrates is not going to say that we don't know whether or not death is a good or a bad thing, but to the contrary, is going to more positively argue that we ought not to fear death because we can know for certain that we have an immortal soul. In other words, we have a soul that's distinct from our bodies, and that gives us reason to believe that our soul will survive our physical death. And so we ought not to fear death, which is, of course, culminated in Socrates' own execution, his own death, right? So let's go ahead and get started. The first quote that we have here involves Socrates saying that the real aim of philosophy is to practice for death and dying, right? What does he mean by this? Well, Plato / Socrates in this dialogue define dying as the separation of the soul from the body. That's what happens when the body experiences physical death. Now, given that conception of death, how exactly is philosophy the preparation for death and dying? Well, philosophy encourages you, on Plato's view, to leave behind the ordinary consideration of your physical, organic body, and to the contrary, to attend to the forms of things, which Plato thinks are eternal and non-corporeal. In other words, they're not physical things, right? The forms aren't physical. The form of justice, for example, is not identifiable with any specific instance of justice. So in this sense, what the philosopher does is the philosopher turns their soul away from the corporeal bodily stuff that we're ordinarily concerned with, towards the higher things, right? The forms and eternal things and their relations. So it follows, on Plato's view, that the philosopher, more than anyone else, should be prepared for death and dying. And the Phaedo dialogue proposes a unique argument for the existence of the soul, right? And it's because we have a soul that Socrates doesn't fear drinking the hemlock and dying, right? Now, how does Plato attempt to show that there's a soul in the Phaedo dialogue? Well, it has to do with this business about forms. There's a really long period in the dialogue that is otherwise very confusing, where some of the characters are comparing the lengths of sticks, right? I mean, that seems pretty far removed from demonstration that there is a soul, right? And what they notice is that while two sticks can be equal to each other, they can instantiate the relationship of equality. Even if you got rid of all of the sticks and all of the physical stuff in the entire universe, there would still be this general form or relation that things could take that is equality. In other words, the form of equality, on Plato's view, both pre-exists and survives all of the physical stuff in the universe being gone. Even if there was no physical stuff in the universe, 2 plus 2 would still equal 4. And what's going on there is an invocation of the form of equality, right? Now the question that Plato/Socrates raises is, how is it that I know these forms if they are this non-physical stuff? And Plato's answer is, of course, that we know the forms through our soul, right? There must be some means for us to acquire knowledge that isn't tied to our living organic body, so it's not our sensory perception, it's not our seeing, hearing, smelling, touching, etc., tasting. It instead is something that we perceive rationally through our non-physical soul. So in this second quote, Socrates says, I assume the existence of a beautiful itself by itself, right? Regardless of any physical things. Of a good and the great and all the rest. If you grant me these, so if you agree that forms exist and agree that they exist, I hope to show you the cause as a result and to find the soul to be immortal. So just like the forms didn't depend on the existence of any physical stuff, so too the soul that can recognize the relations between the forms also does not depend on any kind of physical instantiation. In other words, even if our body should die, our soul will live on. Of course, in this moment, all of Socrates' friends and loved ones are in tears and they're crying and, they're all sad that he's about to go, right? And he accuses them of not really listening to him, right? From his point of view, it doesn't make a difference, right? Death is the separation of the soul from the body. That's what he's trying to accomplish, right? And so Socrates is not sad about dying in the Apology, and indeed thinks about the hemlock not only as a poison, but even as a cure, right? So right before Socrates takes the hemlock, he says, Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Make this offer and do not forget. Asclepius is the god of healing, right? The ancient Greek word pharmakon means both medicine and poison, right? And it means both of these terms because oftentimes medicines can be poisonous if you take enough of the medicine. And so even though hemlock is obviously poisonous to the organic body, Socrates regards it as a medicine, right? He's being healed of the confusion that comes from living within physical reality. And so Socrates is ready and willing to meet his end because of his steadfast belief in an eternal and non-physical soul. Now, I also want to at least briefly talk about another ancient Greek philosopher named Epicurus, who has a short little letter that explains his view on why it is that you ought not to fear death. And while Plato's defense of why you shouldn't fear death relied on the existence of a non-physical soul, Epicurus, to the contrary, is going to argue that you shouldn't fear death because you are a physical thing, right? So with the first quote, we can summarize the basics of Epicurus' view is that we should believe that death is nothing to us, right? And he elaborates on this view in the second quote by saying, when we exist, death is still not present. And when death is present, then we do not exist. In other words, if we are physical things and death is the end of physical things, well, we never experience death, right? It's irrational for us to fear death, in Epicurus's view, because death is never something that we even have the possibility of encountering. And he supplements this with what I would call an argument from sense perception, right? So Epicurus believes in the importance of sensory perception. Plato downplayed the importance of sensory perception, and yet they still arrive at the same conclusion, namely that we shouldn't fear death. Epicurus' argument goes like this. 1, we know how things are through sensory perception. 2, there is no sensory perception of death. And so 3, there is nothing knowable and hence fear-worthy about death. Now that's a very quick summary of Epicurus' argument, but I want to keep this video relatively short. Did you find yourself agreeing more with Plato's view that we shouldn't fear death because of our existence of an immaterial soul? Or did you agree more with Epicurus' argument that we shouldn't fear death because we are physical embodied beings? Or perhaps you don't agree with either of them and you believe that our fear of death is essentially justified. I very much look forward to hearing what you think, and I will see you in the next video.